So what would you say is the largest leap in gaming? Because despite not growing up in this era, I'd easily say the biggest leap gaming took was from the relatively simplistic 8-bit era to the 16-bit powerhouses. No longer were you playing with power, you were playing with superpower or something.
Now you're playing with power, superpower.
The Super Nintendo just had this way of completely shattering expectations, taking simple concepts that emerged on the NES and taking them so much further. Metroid went from an overly ambitious concept for a game with some very rough edges to a full-on adventure with giant atmospheric detailed worlds with Super Metroid. Platformers went from simple addictive concepts to full-on breathing worlds. Mega Man got more extreme. Final Fantasy got, well, actually fun. Kirby was still great. Like, the leap was just ginormous, and even better is that I'd argue that it hasn't really aged all that much. Remember, I didn't grow up with this console, so there's no nostalgia goggles here. The SNES was just a quality console. Now, I don't think every game is quite as good as they're built up to be, but it's not a coincidence that some of my all-time favorite games come from this console.
A bit more Mario, a bit more of what you want. It's 16-bit, and it's yours only if you get new Super Nintendo.
Regardless, that leap, the one that changed everything for so many franchises, you'd have to wonder what it would do for Zelda. I mean, for its time, Zelda 1 was an incredibly ambitious game with way more girth to its world than most NES games could even hope to have. Zelda 2 also existed. No, but seriously, Zelda 2 did add many things that pushed the ambition even further, like full-on towns and larger, more interesting dungeons. I just don't really like it that much. And while I'd personally say that they've aged, and I'll probably stop saying that because Boyd is saying there's a single flaw with an older game makes some people really mad, I don't think that it's too much of a stretch to say that many people would say there's room to grow here. I mean, the idea was there, so it just needed a bit of that superpower, and we might have a legend unlike anything the world had ever seen before. And in 1991, Zelda would get that very same injection of superpower, resulting in a classic that's still beloved to this day. For many, this game would change the way they looked at games, and take them on an adventure that they would never forget. And so join me as we give a great big game over analysis to the supercharged adventure, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. So at least one person is probably wondering, so Duo, what's your personal history with A Link to the Past? Also, why did you take months to do this next Zelda video? The first two came out in like April, what's wrong with you? The real answer is, I'm lazy. But no, seriously, those two questions are ironically quite linked here. For years, I had a very childish bias against A Link to the Past, and whether the reason behind that is fair or extremely stupid is kinda up for debate. Essentially, when I was first getting into Zelda, almost right after finishing The Wind Waker, one of my absolute favorite games in the series and favorite games of all time, I was having a conversation with a dude in a game store, and no joke, this is what he said to me. Wind Waker, Minish Cap, come on, those aren't real Zelda games. Play a real one like A Link to the Past. Once you play it, you'll think the others are terrible by comparison. And being the smart kid that I was, I completely believed him and bought A Link to the Past thinking, oh boy, this'll be so much better than all the others I played. Nostalgia? Bias? What are those two words? And I played it, wasn't impressed by the first couple dungeons, and I just didn't come back to it. And I kept it like that for years. I just assumed, well, now I have to dislike it because that guy built up my expectations too high. Which is dumb. So when I went into this game for a video, I legitimately expected to come out thinking it was just alright, make a video and move on. What did I name this video again? Something dumb like A Link to the Blast? Yeah, that didn't exactly happen. This was my first time fully playing all the way through to the end, and honestly, I liked it. Like, a lot. My thoughts going in were so different than what I came out with that I actually needed a little bit of time to sit on the game and figure out how I felt about it. I'm honestly glad I waited too because boy, this video would have been straight up garbage if I did it right after beating it. Now, it's not my absolute favorite Zelda or even my favorite 2D Zelda, and yes, if you're wondering, it didn't make every other Zelda game look terrible like that guy said, but there's just so much to like here, and I'm kinda sad I didn't really get to experience this until now. So with that overly long personal tangent out of the way, how about we get to, actually talking about the game. Link is awakened in the middle of the night by a telepathic message being sent from Princess Zelda herself, begging him to come save her. After this, Link's uncle leaves the house and tells Link that he'd better stay home. And considering the first thing Link does after this is break the family pottery, yeah, I don't think he's the type to listen. So you head to Hyrule Castle, and can I just say, this section is super cool. The moment you leave the house, it becomes clear just how much of a jump the Super Nintendo allowed for over the previous entries. The sky is stormy with rain and lightning adding to this already pretty serious tone. From the onset, the setup just gets you into the adventure, It's the level of atmosphere that the previous hardware would have struggled to accomplish. So you get into Hyrule Castle via a secret passageway, and you find your uncle in pretty rough shape. He gives you a sword and tells you to save the princess, but not before leaving you off with quite a line. Duo, you can do it. Save the princess. Zelda is your You're what, Uncle? Are we getting into some Sweet Home Alabama territory? But nah, actually, this is just a mistranslation. Don't worry, there's nothing weird going on. I love how against you this whole section feels. The enemies feel way stronger than you, and there are just tons of them around every corner. All you have is this dinky little sword and a lantern, and you're going up against the entire Hyrulean guard force. You feel like you're almost supposed to sneak by. Aided even further by the fact that when you finally do escape the castle, you do so through a shady secret exit that leads you through a sewer system. The whole section just instills this exciting sense of going against a force that's much bigger than you. And it also sets things up for a really interesting moment later where this is all reversed, but we'll get to that later. After you manage to escape Hyrule Castle, Zelda is left in the hands of this priest guy, and you're told the only way to stop Aghanim is to gain access to the Master Sword. And if you want to do that, you'll have to find an elder going by the name of Sahasrahla, which, boy, I really hope I didn't just butcher that name. So then you're released into the Overworld, which we'll talk about in a bit. But the first thing you'll likely do is head to Kakariko Village, where the elder is supposed to be at least. And if you try talking to the villagers, you'll find out that some of them aren't the biggest fans of you right now. So yeah, you know how you saved the princess from Hyrule Castle? Well, Hyrule Castle immediately makes you out to be a wanted criminal because, you know, you kinda kidnapped the princess from it. And what's pretty cool about this is that it has actual weight in terms of the Overworld. It starts with these NPCs, obviously, but later the soldiers from Hyrule Castle start occupying areas that you frequent throughout the game. At some point, they just straight up start leaving guards in Kakariko Village in the hopes of capturing Link. It's a really cool detail I don't hear people mention very often, although I don't even know if it's actually a detail. I could just be crazy, who knows. But yeah, you find out the elder isn't exactly there anymore, and so you head east and find him just kinda chilling near the Eastern Palace. He tells you that the only way to gain access to the Master Sword is to get 3 pendants hidden in 3 different palaces. And with that, the first chunk of the adventure is off, and your goal is set. Time to go beat those dungeons. So first up is the Eastern Palace, which is located right next to the elder. Almost immediately upon entering the dungeon, it becomes clear just how much of a jump has been made in regards to dungeons, even though these dungeons are actually way less crazy than what comes later. Dungeon layouts feel a lot more organic here. In Zelda 1 and 2, they were often very simplistic, likely due to the hardware, but these dungeons feel like full-on, well, dungeons. They also feel a lot more meticulously crafted, with a lot of focus placed on how the dungeon interconnects with itself. Oftentimes there'll be areas just out of reach where you can see something that looks pretty important, and it's all about figuring out how to get there with the pathways available to you. There's also a lot more focus placed on layers, where there are oftentimes multiple floors in a dungeon that interconnect with other floors to make for a really dynamic dungeon going experience compared to the first 2. Also, there's at least a little bit more visual distinctness here going on. In Zelda 1 and 2, the dungeons were often built off of a very obvious set of repeated rooms with nothing really to separate the dungeons visually beyond a change in color. Here though, no, there's so much more going on. Rooms always feel distinct from each other, and there's usually some difference in the theming of the dungeon as well. And heck, this time there's actually set pieces to set each dungeon apart. Like, you look at this and you look at this and you're like, yeah, those are 2 different dungeons. You look at 2 different rooms in Zelda 1 if they were colored black and white, and you really couldn't tell which dungeon they're from. Now obviously, like the past 2 games, A Link to the Past dungeons are focused on 2 major things: combat and puzzle solving. On the combat end, well, things certainly have improved quite a bit. Link still can only attack in 4 directions, but now the sword has less of a stab and more of a swipe. Like, there's an actual arc to your swing, which makes the combat feel a lot better. Well, you know, that and the fact that Link can now move and maneuver a lot better than he could in Zelda 1, to the point where you can actually move in diagonal directions. But yeah, these 2 subtle changes make the combat, and really everything else in the game, feel a lot smoother. Like, sure, the combat and boss fights are better, but even simple things like exploring and roaming the dungeons are now smooth as butter. I still feel like Link could move a little bit faster, and it'd be great if his sword reached just a little bit further, since its range feels a little too short for my liking, but it's really not that big of an issue. And hey, they nailed it in the next game anyway, so it's not a big deal. Now, as far as the puzzle solving goes, A Link to the Past goes for a bit of a mix between the original Zelda style of puzzles and the type that would later become the focus from Ocarina of Time forward. On the Zelda 1 end of things, there's still quite a bit of focus on pushing blocks, bombing walls in the dungeon, and finding keys strewn about the dungeon. A nice change is that A Link to the Past fixes a problem I had with the original game in regards to some of the vaguer elements. For example, now when a wall is bombable, it usually has subtle cracks in the wall to clue you in on that. The whole game makes changes like this, which thankfully takes any of the guesswork out of not only the dungeon exploration, but even the overworld as well. It's a small change, but it's one I appreciate a whole lot. On the other half of the puzzle spectrum, we have a lot more stuff akin to stuff we'd see later in the series. Like, you know, real puzzles. There's puzzles focusing on the layering of the dungeon, or using your dungeon items in a creative way, you know, all that good stuff. I've always preferred that style of puzzle solving personally, and so it's really great that A Link to the Past finally brings it to the forefront. The only real issue I have is with the keys, namely just some of them. You can get keys from a variety of actions, from puzzle solving to clearing a room full of enemies, but the one type I I never really gelled with was the one where you just kind of get one for breaking a pot. Like, it never really tripped me up or anything because I broke every pot I could, but it always felt kind of weird since when I got one from a pot, it was always like, oh, okay, I guess I don't have to solve the puzzle for this one, I guess. It's also just not very ideal because it means you pretty much have to break every pot you come across because it might have a key in it, which, you know, that kind of sucks since some of these things have health pickups that I might want to leave for later, but I don't want to miss anything, so I can't really do that, which is a little unfortunate. But yeah, the dungeons overall are pretty fun here, and we'll be discussing a little bit more about them later, but regardless, there's one aspect here that feels even more fun than the dungeons. So as far as the whole Zelda structure split, with half the game being spent in the overworld and half being spent in the dungeons, I've always been more of a fan of the overworld segments. Now don't get me wrong, the dungeons are cool too, but I just get this immense satisfaction from exploring the overworld, finding all these cool little secrets, talking to NPCs, and using the dungeon items to make my way through areas that I couldn't get to before. It's almost got that Metroid type appeal, you know? As you get stronger and get more abilities, you can explore more. It's just such a satisfying way of doing things. Now, while I wasn't a huge fan of the previous game's overworlds, A Link to the Past freaking nails it here. I might even go as far to say that the overworld is my favorite thing about the game. And I think the best way to see just how much of a jump Link to the Past makes in regards to this is to take a look back for a moment. In Zelda 1, the overworld was dense for the time, but both visually and structurally rather simple. Landmarks and other notable set pieces are very uncommon, with a couple outlier lakes and a graveyard punctuating a world mostly comprised of forests, hills, and canyons that all look basically the same. Zelda 2, if anything, de-emphasizes things a bit, taking the free-roaming world of the original and dramatically restricting your ability to explore the overworld, instead shifting the focus to mainly 2D areas. So after those two, now show me A Link to the Past. The moment you're allowed to explore for real, it becomes noticeable just how much more there is here. You exit out into a graveyard essentially, take a very short trip to the left, and there's a mysterious forest a little north. Head a little south and there's an entire town. If you continue even further south, you'll find a hidden off nook full of houses, and even further still is a swamp and a whole desert. There are dangerous, poorly lit caves, a mountain complete with constantly falling rocks, a giant castle, ruins, rivers, lakes. It's just such a massive jump from the previous games. The diversity of the environments is one thing, but there's just a lot more interesting stuff to find too. While exploring, you're likely to come across all these little mysterious things just teasing you as to what you're supposed to do with them. For example, early on I came across this boy playing a flute in the forest, but just as I went to talk to him, he just vanished. Like, boom, he's gone. So for the rest of the game, it was just driving me crazy trying to figure out what his deal was. Like, was he a ghost? Or is the flute letting him teleport away at will? Does he just dislike me so much that he ascend to a new plane just so he doesn't have to talk to me? Probably. Later, I talked to one of the NPCs in Kakariko Village who talked about their missing son. And then I realized, hey, I saw a couple people who had apparently gotten stuck in the Dark World, and then I connected the dots and used the mirror to finally be able to talk with the dude. And from this whole kerfuffle, I got the ability to fast travel around Hyrule, which, can I just say, is a surprisingly nice ability that wasn't very common in this era, so thank you, Nintendo. Regardless, this whole quest thing, the game is chock full of things like this. Just all these little neat moments and all these really cool little secrets. You can find a missing blacksmith to upgrade your sword, you can play this little race minigame to get a piece of heart, and speaking of pieces of heart, their inclusion here is just freaking genius. They're hidden in a variety of areas, and there's a number of different ways of getting them. Sometimes you just find them by taking a not so obvious path, sometimes they're hidden by a short puzzle, but regardless of how they're hidden, they serve as an extremely useful collectible and one that's very fun to find. And the great part is that no matter what kind of experience you're looking for, these are approached in such a way that they're always a benefit to the game regardless of what playstyle you like exploring and finding everything, then these, alongside several other little secret rewards, not only serve as a useful prize, but honestly, they're just really fun to find. Prefer to make things just a little bit more challenging like me? Well, you don't have to get all of them, so just by exploring as you normally would, you'll still come across a lot of the cooler quests, but you can get as few or as many upgrades as you want, meaning the game can be as hard or as easy as you want. It's a smart system that rewards all types of players with the kind of experience they want, and it makes for a game that can please almost any crowd without sacrificing the experience of other crowds. And something I've always loved about this style of Overworld is that it just allows for all these little fun mini narratives and stories that anyone will have if they've played the game. So here's an example. Early on, I came across this narrow path going down a river, and I said to myself, oh hey, it can't be that bad, right? And right after that, I was assaulted with so many Zoras that I pretty much had to run away. But I vowed revenge on this stupid river. So I came back later stronger and ready to take it on, and this time I beat it way easier, probably because I was a little less bad at the game and also because I had more hearts. And at the end, I was rewarded with the flippers, allowing me to swim much earlier than I even needed to. Like, the game didn't tell me that this was there or that I needed to go do that, I just did it because the game showed me something interesting and I wanted to see what the deal was. Now, it could be argued that I could have gone there even earlier and gotten it, and yeah, that would have been true if I was good at the game, but I'm not. Regardless, there's just so many opportunities for moments like this and I freaking love it. Though the best one has to have been when I finally got the Master Sword. So you've got all 3 pendants from the dungeons across Hyrule and you decide to head to the Lost Woods, where several NPCs imply the Master Sword lies. But things aren't quite what you'd expect. There are these freaking fake Master Swords littered around the forest for some reason, mostly there to trick you, I guess. And there's these thief guys that just bump into you and take your stuff, which I don't know why, but I just find it hilarious that almost all the enemies in this game are out for blood and these guys just want your stuff. Anyways, you manage to evade all the thieves and false swords and you finally find the legendary sword itself. And once you pull it out, things get wild. The entire game up to this point, you've had to rely on your short-range sword and what little recourses you had to fight enemies. Unless you've been grabbing every heart piece possible as well, you're still pretty weak, and so when you finally get the sword for the first time, the power jump is just electrifying. For one, your sword has basically double the strength, which is great in and of itself, but you also gain the ability to shoot long-reaching beams from your sword, providing you with an easily spammable weapon that just tears through everything in your way early game. After this, you ransack Hyrule Castle, and all of those enemies that were tough in the beginning and causing you problems are just cannon fodder, essentially. It's a fantastic, electrifying power trip that makes you feel like you're on top of the world, only for the rug to be pulled out from you right after. After a brief fight with Aghanim where you defeat him pretty easily because the fight's kind of a joke, right when you think, alright, this is it, bam, you're in the Dark World now. Good luck! And to contrast your experience in the Light World, as you'll find out very quickly, enemies in the Dark World aren't playing around here. They purposely place these big guys right at the bottom of this pyramid, and fighting them is just nuts early on. The beam sword barely touches them, and if they hit you, ugh. And once you exit that area, you'll find out real quick that you basically can't go anywhere with the tools you have. In this world, most of the bridges are destroyed, friendly NPCs are basically nowhere to be found, and most paths are blocked off. You almost feel like you're supposed to sneak around this area, kind of interesting because it not only compares to the beginning of the game in the castle, but it makes you feel like you've gotten into something way over your head here. I don't know if this was planned, but it feels like it was planned. It so quickly shows you power only to just as quickly toss you right back down and show you just how far you are from the top. It's such a jarring change, but it's just so effective at conveying the threat you face. You're essentially alone and left to face not only just a couple guards from Hyrule Castle or whatever, but an entire parallel dimension that wants you dead. And make no mistake, this parallel dimension, the Dark World, is an entirely new area to explore. It takes the basic foundation of the Light World and then warps and twists it, making traversing it its own kind of puzzle. Like so many of the things that you just kind of take for granted in Light World, like bridges and stuff, they're just completely gone. And so you're always having to find alternate ways of getting from place to place. Usually, in fact, using the Light World itself. Littered throughout the Light World are several warp points that allow you to jump between the 2 overworlds immediately, meaning that exploring the Light World doesn't necessarily become worthless the moment you unlock the Dark World. I'd only like it if there was a little more focus on the interplay between the Dark World and Light Worlds though. Like, there are a couple minor quests where you have to transport between the 2, and even a really cool puzzle in the second Dark World dungeon involving it. But beyond that, this really feels like they didn't do a whole lot with this whole concept. Regardless, your goal in the Dark World is to go to 7 different dungeons scattered across Hyrule, conquer the challenges within, and save the descendant of one of the 7 sages trapped within. You see, in the past, 7 sages were the only ones able to repel Ganon's power, and so as a result, their descendants were imprisoned, essentially rendering Ganon invincible if they aren't saved. And here's where my biggest issue with A Link to the Past comes about. You see, the game itself is an absolute blast to play, but the actual narrative holding those events together, the actual world and people I'm doing all this to save, they're not very interesting. Now, on an actual narrative level, things are definitely an improvement here over the past 2 games because, you know, this one has an actual story. But as for the story itself, there's just not a lot going on here. After that cool intro at the beginning, the story just kinda stops. Go beat 3 dungeons, get the Master Sword, go to the Dark World, beat 7 more dungeons, beat Ganon, that's it. The narrative is still relatively simple here, which is fine normally. Several games later in the series use pretty much the same exact outline, but the difference between A Link to the Past and, say, Ocarina of Time is that there's more going going on outside of the major plot points. There's characters to interact with, ones with notable designs and odd personalities. There are smaller side quests with their own little narratives. In A Link to the Past, sure, there are NPCs, but most of them are pretty one-note and have nothing interesting going on for them. And heck, even the main 3 Triforce users, the main characters of this game, have basically nothing going on. Link doesn't talk or emote, Zelda straight up gets like no dialogue, essentially being reserved for a bit of exposition at the last dungeon. Bizarrely, actually, it's the villains who get the most attention for some reason. Not only do they arguably have the most unique interactions in the game, and probably the most interactions in general, but they even have a decent amount of backstory about the whole takeover of the Dark World and the eventual corruption of it, the massacre they started in an attempt to take over the Light World, then the whole way they went about their plans. Like, there's a lot more here, but even so, the actual personality of the bad guys just boils down to, well, bad guys. And that's the thing, narratively speaking, there's just nothing here for me to latch onto. Sure, I made up my own micro-narratives in my head, and hey, maybe that was the whole point, but this still doesn't change the fact that I just don't really care about any of the characters here. And I know for some people that doesn't matter. For some, in fact, the lack of major narrative elements and dialogue just means they can get to the game quicker, but that's just not how it is for me. Like it or not, the world, the characters, the story, those things are something I love about Zelda, and so the fact that they just don't really get anything here in A Link to the Past in that regard is kinda sad. But hey, you know what, that's not the only thing I like about Zelda games, because while I do prefer the overworld side of things, and I do like the stories as well, I absolutely love seeing what the games come up with for the dungeons, and thankfully A Link to the Past has some really cool dungeon designs. The Dark World is where Nintendo really got creative with the dungeon concepts. Each one, for the most part at least, has some unique gimmick or focus that makes each one freaking cool to experience. And honestly, some of these concepts, I don't think I've actually seen them in any other Zelda game, which is really neat. Skull Woods, for example, has the player entering and exiting the dungeon in the different points of the overworld, with a huge focus on trying to figure out what chunks of the dungeon are important and when, which is something I was genuinely kind of surprised by. Like, that direct interaction between dungeon and overworld is just super neat. Swamp Palace, while a concept that's a little more commonly used in the series, features a really cool water level concept, and unlike most attempts at the water level gimmick, this dungeon is actually fun. Also, it's where you get the hook shot, which is by far the coolest item in the entire series, so that's automatically a plus. And Thieves Town is flat out my favorite dungeon in the game. It already had a layout that felt a little more action-packed, which is a nice change of pace, but the twist with the captured lady was so cool. I was so confused as to what she wanted, because she wanted to leave, but she wouldn't go outside, and then when I finally connected the dots and revealed the truth, it was such a freaking cool moment. Not every dungeon's a winner though, and I know what you're thinking, oh boy, this is where he's gonna bring up the Ice Palace, and nah, I actually like that one. The focus on layer design and trying to figure out how the layers connect was neat. It had some really fun puzzles, and honestly, I didn't mind the ice physics. Like, it was fun, and I'd honestly say it's a little underrated. No, there were 2 dungeons I didn't really care for here. First was the Palace of Darkness, where my issues mainly came from how tedious it is to traverse. There are rooms here that feel like they're just here to waste your time, and even worse is the layout makes you go back and forth in these pretty annoying rooms, and because the enemies constantly respawn, it's just kind of an annoying dungeon to go through. It's just kinda lame. And speaking of kinda lame actually, this may be a bit of a controversial opinion, but honestly, Turtle Rock is really boring for a penultimate dungeon. Like, mechanically, it's a slow-moving dungeon with way too much focus on these meandering carts. It's already not a fun mechanic in general, but considering this is the main focus of it, this makes the whole dungeon feel like a slog. And honestly, it's not even that hard either. I beat it fairly easily, and the puzzles never really stumped me. Like, I wouldn't even call it terrible, the layout works, it's just really boring. Now, technically it doesn't have to be the final dungeon, as A Link to the Past lets you tackle dungeons in whatever order you want, but clearly considering the numbering, Nintendo wanted this to be the last dungeon you went through, which is kinda lame. And yeah, speaking of things that come last, the end of every dungeon features a boss fight, and I completely forgot to mention these in my first draft of the script, and that might be for a good reason. The bosses here aren't bad per se, just not super interesting. Most of them are a little too simple and way too easy. The only exceptions were this moth guy, who was difficult but not in a very fun way, and the Helmarock King, who was pretty neat. Well, actually, I guess there's technically one more exception, the final boss, but we haven't got there yet. So you've saved the 7 sages, collected as many upgrades as you're willing to at least, and you've made sure to stock up on potions. It's time to face the final dungeon, Ganon's Tower. Honestly, this was a really fun one, and it's really befitting of being a final dungeon considering that it's a lot more difficult than the usual ones. It makes creative uses of your abilities, and in one case, it straight up shocked me with something I didn't know I could do. Like, seriously, it's just a solid final dungeon. And as for the fight with Ganon, it's fun too. He's probably my favorite fight in the game, honestly. He just feels a lot more dynamic than past bosses. Not much more to say about it. It's just cool. And thus, Hyrule is saved. And that was A Link to the Past. It was definitely a solid surprise. Honestly, I had a lot more fun with it than I expected to. And heck, it's even cooler now knowing the context of what released before it and just how much of an improvement this game was. The world is bigger with so much more to do and see, and critically much more interesting things to find. The dungeons are grander in scale and complexity, the gameplay is much smoother, the combat's much more fun, and as a game, it's just much more engaging. This game is finally the point in the series where it feels like Zelda to me. It's, well, just as the title described it, Link to the Past was a blast, and I'm glad I finally got to experience it. That being said, I do feel as if I was kind of missing something. While I've spent a lot of time in this video talking about all the things I liked, something still, even in the last moments of making this video, that hasn't quite left is this feeling that I didn't quite get A Link to the Past completely. Sure, I enjoyed it, but not nearly as much as a lot of others seem to have. As much as the gameplay really clicked with me, I can't really say the game resonated with me beyond that. It doesn't really hit me the same way other Zelda games do, and I think I know why. I tried to not let it overwhelm the video, but no matter how long I played, I just got this feeling like I had done this all before. Like I had seen almost everything A Link to the Past had done be done better somewhere else in the series. And like, yeah, I can't really blame the game for that. If anything, the fact that a lot of its ideas got reused implies that the game really had something good going. But when later games have taken so much, even to the point of taking Link to the Past's map, and when I've played all of those games before this one, it's just hard for me to feel like it's quite as impressive now. But that's just how it is. Obviously, there's a huge difference between someone playing this for the first time as a kid, seeing just how much the series had grown, and playing it for the first time as a jaded adult who's seen this all before. And while I'm a little sad I can't quite get the same feelings from it that others do, I'm glad that regardless of all I've just said, I still enjoyed it. And hey, it clearly did resonate with a lot of people, because the very next game in this series would start off as an attempt to port this beloved game to the Game Boy, but would end up as something entirely unique. And then they remade it on Switch, which I'll also be talking about. Join me next time as we get to The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, the miniature handheld epic that I love to pieces. Anyways, I guess that's game over. Analysis. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed.